Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Laubach. Thank you for joining me in this podcast. So this is going to be more of a listening exercise, but I will put main ideas and guiding questions in the video description so you can follow along. Today, we're going to explore two historic gatherings that laid the foundation for revolution and independence: the First and Second Continental Congresses. Let's start with the First Continental Congress, which took place from September 5th to October 26th, 1774, in Philadelphia. By this time, relations between Britain and its American colonies had been deteriorating for years. Tensions really boiled over after the passing of the Intolerable Acts, a set of punitive laws imposed by the British Parliament in response to the Boston Tea Party in 1773, where American colonists, frustrated with British taxation policies, dumped an entire shipment of tea into the Boston harbor. These Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts, were meant to bring the rebellious colonies, especially Massachusetts, back under control. They included the Boston Port Act, which closed the port until the tea was paid for, the Massachusetts Government Act, which effectively stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance, and the Quartering Act, which allowed British troops to be housed in private homes. The laws were seen by the colonists as a direct assault on their liberties. In response, 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia being the only one not represented, sent delegates to Philadelphia to figure out how to deal with these increasingly aggressive measures. It's important to note that while the colonies were angry, they weren't ready to declare independence quite yet. Most of them still saw themselves as British subjects and were hoping to find a way to restore their rights and live peacefully within the British Empire. So what did they do? First, the delegates decided on a collective response to British oppression. They created the Continental Association, which called for a boycott of British goods. The boycott wasn't just about cutting economic ties. It was a way to apply pressure to Britain without resorting to violence. But this wasn't simply a recommendation. Local committees of correspondence and committees of inspection were established across the colonies to enforce the boycotts. If someone didn't comply, they could be shamed or even ostracized. It was one of the first major steps toward a united colonial resistance. At the same time, the Congress drafted a formal petition to King George III. This petition, known as the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, affirmed their loyalty to the king, but condemned the Intolerable Acts and asserted that only the colonies' own legislatures had the right to tax them. The Congress wasn't yet pushing for independence, but they were making it clear that they wouldn't accept Parliament's overreach. The First Continental Congress didn't accomplish everything it set out to, but it laid the groundwork for future collaboration among the colonies. The delegates agreed to reconvene if their grievances weren't addressed. And as we know, things escalated from there. Now let's fast forward to May 10th, 1775, when the Second Continental Congress convened. This time, the situation was much more dire. On April 19th, 1775, a few weeks earlier, the battles of Lexington and Concord had erupted in Massachusetts. These were the first military engagements between the colonial militias and British troops, and the famous shot heard round the world marked the start of armed conflict. So when the delegates gathered again in Philadelphia, they weren't just talking about political resolutions anymore. War had already begun. The Second Continental Congress faced an enormous task. They had to organize a military effort, and quickly. One of their major decisions was to establish the Continental Army. Up until this point, individual colonial militias were organizing at local and regional levels, but now they needed a unified force that could defend all the colonies. To lead that army, the Congress appointed George Washington. He was a delegate from Virginia. Washington was a natural choice for several reasons. He had military experience from his service in the French and Indian War, if you'll remember, and his selection helped bring the southern colonies into the fold since he was from the South. This move helped unify the colonies, which was crucial as they headed into what would become a full-scale war. Even with the conflict growing, many delegates still held out hope for peace with Britain. That is why in July of 1775, the Congress sent the Olive Branch petition to King George III. The petition expressed loyalty to the crown and asked the king to intervene and prevent further conflict. But King George III refused to even consider the petition. Instead, he declared the colonies in open rebellion, effectively shutting the door on any possible chance of reconciliation. This rejection was a big turning point. After that, the conversation in Congress began to shift more decisively towards independence. Still, not everyone was on board at first. There were deep divisions among the delegates. Some, particularly in the middle colonies like Pennsylvania and New York, were hesitant to sever ties with Britain completely. But over the next year, the tide turned, especially after the publication of Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, in early 1776. Paine's pamphlet made a strong, straightforward argument for independence, and it resonated deeply with both the public and many members of the Congress. By the summer of 1776, momentum for independence was unstoppable. On July 2nd, 1776, Congress voted in favor of independence from Britain, and 2 days later, on July 4th, they adopted the Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. This document didn't just declare independence, it articulated the colony's philosophical reasons for breaking away, emphasizing natural rights, equality, and the consent of the governed. Many Enlightenment thinking ideas. But the Second Continental Congress's work didn't stop with the Declaration of Independence. They had to govern a nation at war. They managed diplomacy, seeking crucial alliances, most notably with France, whose support would eventually tip the scales in favor of the American cause. They also faced enormous financial challenges, as the war was expensive, and they struggled to fund it, resorting to printing continental currency, a form of paper money, which eventually led to a severe inflation in the colonies. In 1777, the Congress also drafted the Articles of Confederation, which would serve as the constitution for the newly independent states. The Articles were officially ratified in 1781, and while they created a weak central government and had many weaknesses in it, they were an important first step toward national unity. The Second Continental Congress continued to govern until 1781, when it was taken over by the Congress of the Confederation under the Articles of Confederation. But its legacy is monumental. It led the colonies through revolution, declared independence, and laid the foundation for what would become the United States. So there you have it. The First Continental Congress was an attempt to resolve the growing conflict with Britain peacefully, while the Second Continental Congress was about taking control of the situation and organizing the colonies for war and ultimately declaring independence. Together, these two Congresses set the stage for revolution and the birth of a new nation. So I hope you learn more about the First and Second Continental Congresses. Thanks for tuning in and have a great rest of the day.